Today on Crazed Performance Repair, let's talk a little bit about oil pressure on these Chevy trucks. Now, I have a Silverado here. I believe it's a 2012, but it's one of the DOD motors, and it should have anywhere between 35 to 45 at idle, basically. What happens with this truck is it works fine while it's cold, and it works fine for quite a while. The oil pressure drops after some time, and it actually drops quite a bit. So it's getting down to the 20 psi range, and that's a problem. Now, a lot of times it can be the screen that is inside the VLOM causing this if it gets plugged up, because the oil pressure sensor reads off of what's behind that screen. So if the screen's plugged up, it's going to get an incorrect reading. This particular truck does not have a screen, so I know that's not the issue. Also, I verified that I have that oil pressure at the oil filter by going to what is a gauge, a mechanical gauge, down by the filter. I made a special adapter. So you can see where the oil pressure is at right now. It's at anywhere between 23 and 26, give or take. So that mechanical gauge, you can't see it right now, but I'll try and zoom in on it here. You can see the line. Come on now. See if I can highlight it. There we go. You can see the line going up over that drive shaft, but it goes to where the oil cooler line bolt flange bolts onto. I actually made an adapter that has a fitting on it that goes to my fuel pressure gauge, and it comes off, goes to the gauge, and that's where I'm getting that reading from. So this particular vehicle, you can see over here, I have some Lucas. What I am going to do, now you can see how that thing was fluctuating, that gauge. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and drop some of this Lucas in there, and if that fluctuating part of the gauge smooths out and the oil pressure goes up, I'm going to say his bearing clearance is getting a little shy. So I'm going to go ahead, put about a half of one of the smaller bottles of Lucas. You know, normally it's just a little quart bottle. I have the big jug because it's a better price to get it that way. So I'm going to put about a half of a quart of Lucas in here and let it run, watch the gauge, and see what happens. Okay, so this is pretty much immediately after doing the oil stabilizer, and you can see the oil pressure is up substantially. It's up another 5 pounds, maybe 6 pounds, and you know, I didn't add a whole lot. I mean, only half a quart. It's pretty much what you would put in one of these motors when you're doing it anyway. So the fact that the pressure raised, but it's still fluctuating like crazy, makes me wonder a little bit. But I'm going to let it run for a little while, let the Lucas get nice and hot, and see if the pressure drops back down. I'm sure the Lucas is probably already up to temperature, to be honest, but I'm still going to let it run a little while, see if it drops down. So basically you can see here that the oil pressure is fluctuating still quite a bit, but the oil pressure is higher. So that higher oil pressure is the part that we're actually not worried about at this point. We can see the pressure went higher because of the thicker oil, which is kind of what I expected, but that fluctuating did not change. So we have a theory here, and that is that it's the oil sump allowing air into there, and that fluctuating is actually the aeration causing the pressure to jump around. Now the computer, like I said, don't see that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add some more oil. Now in this case I'm going to use ATF because the customer and I both agree we might as well clean out the engine while we're at it. But I'm going to add 2 quarts. I'm actually going to overfill this engine at idle. It's not going to cause much of a problem. It's not going to foameth like crazy and cause a big issue. And I'm not going to run it long enough with that extra oil in there to actually cause an issue anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add those 2 quarts, and then I have the hoist sitting in that position. You can see the front arm is away, the back arm is under. I'm going to lift up just the back of the vehicle and tip the truck this way. And the reason for tipping the truck that direction is because the oil sump O-ring is actually in the front of the motor. That's where the oil pump is right in the front of the motor, and we're hoping to get enough oil, if the 2 quarts doesn't do it, to get enough oil high enough in the front of the motor that it'll actually stop the fluttering. Now if the fluttering stops, we know for a fact, it's confirmed that the oil filter or oil pump is actually sucking air because the O-ring has gone bad. So I'm going to go ahead and start this thing up, start adding the oil, and start watching the pressure all at the same time here. I'm going to give you guys a view of the oil pressure gauge when it starts up. And the reason I'm giving you guys this view is because I need to know what that oil pressure does when I fire it up anyway. See how long it takes to actually fill that pressure gauge up. So I would say that oil pressure went up really fast, which is a good sign. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is add all the oil, or ATF in this case, to help clean the motor out, into here, and we're going to see what happens with that gauge. We'll check after each quart, and then we will check after I jack it up if I need to, if it hasn't changed the pressure yet. Now I expect the pressure to drop a little bit because this is a lot thinner than engine oil. So that's where the pressure is right now, right around the 46 to 50 mark. Okay, now that we got 2 quarts of ATF in there, I noticed the motor's starting to tick a little bit, so it's got something a little loose. The oil pressure has dropped slightly, but the truck's also warming up slowly, so really not noticeable. So it's still fluttering, so I'm going to go ahead and jack the truck up. Alright, I'm not sure how well you can see the angle. Alright, to give you an idea, you can see the back tire is up, the front is down. We're at a decent amount of an angle, but the fluttering has not changed. The oil pressure is still dropping slightly, or dropped a little bit more, so I'd imagine it's just getting warmer. I got a little more room to lift it up, so I'm going to do that. And we are still fluttering like crazy. Well, for those of you who have been following me for a little while now, you know that if I'm standing here, I'm going to be going over some explanation. So it's been a few days since the last little video clip, so we'll try and go over this real quick. But basically, the gist of the scenario is those fluctuations of the gauge, the fluttering of the gauge, has been bothering me, or was bothering me. I really am not convinced that that is not air in the system. At least I was not yet. The customer and I decided that there's either one of two things. Now, there is a TSB for the oil pressure on these particular vehicles that calls for replacement of lifters. And the reason that they mention that is because I guess the lifters will start to fail and they'll be blowing a bunch of oil past them and squirting a little bit too far. So when it's doing that, it's bleeding the oil pressure temporarily and causing a flutter and squirting extra oil out of the lifter. Now, they did not mention fluttering of the gauge because they did not mention anything oil pressure, but I took it as a good possibility as to a scenario that could be causing the oil pressure flutter, since I could not find a way to prove necessarily that there was air in it. But I still, like I said, am not 100% convinced that it's air. So I decided to build a special gauge, very unique tool that I can use to test this. So I ordered some parts, and amongst ordering those parts, of course, I had to wait for them to come in, and that is why I'm talking to you a few days later. So we're going to go ahead, go out there, and take a look at the truck and what I have done, what I have come up with, and then we're going to fire it up, take a look at how the gauge works, and then I will explain how I built it for you guys, so that if you decide you want to build one of your own, you can certainly try and do that, or do that, and that way you can do this test yourselves. Okay, so we're sitting in front of the truck here now, and you can see I have this contraption over here. You got the line going in, and then you got the oil cooler on the radiator. I'll get a little bit better focus here. And on this contraption I've made, you can see there's a window right here. So there's a window on this side and on the other side. There's just a brace bar on each side of this that supports that, but this is a glass tube inside here, and because that's a glass tube, I can see the oil flowing through here. So the theory is that while the oil is flowing through here, I'll be able to see the bubbles going across. This does flow extremely fast, and it's very hard, and there's a couple things that might be reasoning why I would not necessarily see bubbles, and I'll explain that in a second. But first I'm going to go ahead and fire this truck up so you guys can see this in action. Okay, so let's go ahead and fire this thing up. It is cold. It's probably, I don't know, 60 degrees or so out here. There we go. Okay, so it's 58 degrees outside right now. You can see the oil pressure is, I don't know, what would that be? So 60 would be that middle, so it'd probably be 50-ish on there. So on this gauge we have about 55 psi. It's fluttering lightly, but not very bad right now with the oil thicker because it's cold. You can see there's no, oh, there goes one little bubble flowing by. It's definitely flowing a lot slower with the oil cold. Normally that bubble would have flew by. That was a really small bubble. So let's talk about a couple things quick. Now the only thing I'm thinking is if the oil is going from the pump to this cooler first, then I'm definitely going to see the bubbles. They'll be obvious. They'll be pretty good sized bubbles. But if it goes through the filter first, my concern is as it goes through the filter, it'll go through that fine filtration, you know, the screen that's in there more or less. And when it does that, it'll disperse the bubble into a bunch of micro bubbles, and it might almost like a form of homogenizing where the bubbles are so dang small that I can't even see them. But you would think that I would still end up with some collection of bubbles where it would throw a bubble occasionally by the glass. But if it doesn't do that because of how high it flows, then I'm not going to see the bubbles. So that's my concern there. Right now the gauge is not fluttering very much at all, which is kind of interesting because normally it was fluttering pretty much no matter what I did with the other gauge. Now the other gauge was mounted right at the filter housing, so it was seeing the in and the out of the oil cooler. Right now I'm only seeing the input of the oil cooler, the output is on the other side. So I wonder if the output has a little bit different response. I should probably see if I can squeeze this tool down there by the output and try reading it there. Maybe I'll have more flutter there. Now, when it was warm, I did have this running with this tool on there before, and when it was warm, it was fluttering a little bit more, but still not as much as the flutter was happening when I had it on the other deal. But this is a different gauge as well. You know, this is not the same exact gauge I was using. It is not a liquid-filled gauge, at least, so I don't have to worry about it just being absorbed by a liquid-filled gauge. So I'm going to go ahead, get this tool off of here, give you guys a look at it, and then we'll talk about my next step. Okay, so I got the unit out. You can see my finger moving back there. So you can see it's got a window that goes clean through, which is really nice because you can see how dirty your oil is and so forth. Now, if I wanted to do the right thing, I'd probably use this thing for more than one thing. And by that, I mean, because it's got this window, I can see how clean the oil is. So, for instance, when I'm doing my engine flushes from now on, I will probably use this unit just so I can see the oil. Because what I do is I drain out the oil, I fill it with ATF, and then I'd be able to see how dirty it's getting throughout the cleaning process. So this will be kind of handy for that as well. Now, you can see that this has quite a few fittings and attachments on here. We have quite a few 90s. There's a lot of brass, this window thing, and all these parts kind of were expensive. I mean, this is probably 120 bucks worth of materials. Now, this guy here, we have a barb fitting, and I got a slot right here. This is the slot that the locking ring goes into. So this guy right here, this little metal ring, locks into that. This fitting, you can get at any local Napa or whatever, and then that has a certain thread, which I'll show you in a second, that I bought a tap for because of dash 10 AN fittings, I believe. But this little locking section right here, so you got that's where the clip goes in, and then I put this barb in here. Now this is all done on the lathe, but this little barb here is the stopper for where it bottoms out inside the fitting. You can see there, and then the O-ring is just past it. Honestly, I probably made this just a hair too small, so I might redo this end of it just because I want a little bit better seal right where this is. I had to replace the O-ring in the fitting just so it would seal. So I want this to be a little bit tighter than it is, but I'll redo this fitting and then it'll be good to go. So kind of a neat little tool, and then of course you have to have a pressure gauge. Damn, that train. And of course you have to have a pressure gauge. Ah, the train is so loud. Alright, that train is driving me nuts. So anyway, you can see I have the line back in there. You do want to try and make sure that you don't forget to push this on. So the reason for this little guy, for those of you who don't know, is to hold the little metal clip from popping back out. So it's kind of a nice little safety feature that GM gives on these style lines. Actually, a lot of companies do it. But anyway, GM is the most common. So there's that. I also spilled oil kind of all over the place. This is wet from brake clean right now because I took brake clean and splashed everything. So there's brake clean all over the place. But as soon as that dries up, it'll look perfectly fine. One thing that it does do is leave a little bit of a mess. So I have to ask for your guys' opinion. Give me an opinion in the comments below. I want to know, what do you guys think? Should I offer to rent something like this? Would this be something worth putting on my website? I would think it might be something handy to put on the website as maybe a rental tool kind of a thing. Maybe I should build a second one. I don't know. Give me your thoughts. We'll see how it goes. If you guys think that it would be something good and worthwhile to rent, you know, maybe throw up something. If you needed it, what would you pay for it to rent it? Obviously, I'd have to put more on the card initially because of, you know, making sure that you return the darn thing. But yeah, if you were to rent it, what would you be willing to pay to rent a unique tool like that, or maybe even buy? Maybe I could just make the damn things and sell them every so often. I don't know about the demand though. The demand would be maybe a little higher than I'm willing to put out, because making things like that takes time. So give me your comments below. Let me know. The next step on this truck is going to be the valve covers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the valve covers off. Once I have the valve covers off, I'm going to watch all the rockers while I crank it over, and I'm going to watch how the lifters squirt out of the rocker arms. So if I have one that's just blowing a ton of oil out, I'm going to assume that's where I'm losing my pressure from. I took it apart here. I have the valve cover just plugged into the PCV valve. That way we don't have an excessive amount of vacuum leak. I have the coils all plugged in, and everything's ready to go. I actually fired it up once just so I could see for myself before I even put it on camera. Now, one of the rockers is spitting out oil much more so than the rest of them, so I do believe I have a lifter issue. However, because of the way these lifters are designed, I might have a solution to fix this issue, and it might also explain why the pressure was not fluctuating as much after I ran it as long as I did. What I think is maybe there's a piece of debris caught in there. So here we have it. This is the breakout of lifters. We have a DOD lifter up here, non-DOD lifter down here. Now regardless of whether it's DOD or not, it is still designed relatively the same. So we're going to go ahead and take a quick peek at what is going on inside these darn lifters. Okay, so you can see the non-DOD lifter here. This guy sits like this, okay, and then there's hydraulic pressure that's allowed into here, and then this little smooth bore area and this smooth bore area kind of seal things. And so there's one of two things going on. Either this section, which has some kind of a, I don't think you can see it, no, you can't really see it. There's some kind of a valving going on in here, and it's allowing oil to blow by this way through whatever's inside here, or the bore inside this area is worn out. So if it's not the bore, if it's the valving that's going on inside there, which this one does not have, this one only has the check valve. So this is the DOD one. It sits like this, and then of course the bore here is what seals that one by itself. So I'm gonna go take a look, see what cylinder it is, and show you guys the thing actually acting up. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead and fire it up. We gotta go quick because I don't want to spray oil all over the exhaust manifold. It will get messy. I got a flashlight ready to go. Okay, so you can see that one right there splattering quite a bit of oil. And if you go to the rest of them, they're dry. They have very, very little to no oil coming out of them. And so I would say that one right there is the one I got to go for. And so I'm going to go ahead and look here at what cylinder that is. So we got cylinder 1 right here. Then we go to that lifter, which is right here. And these two are a pair, and so that's cylinder 3. Cylinder 3 is not a DOD cylinder. So since cylinder 3 is not a DOD cylinder, I gotta consider the non-DOD lifter. So we're gonna go back, look at those lifters, and see if my solution will work that I'm considering here. So what my theory is if this lifter in this section here has failed to where it's pushing more oil through the push rod, and that is why it's spitting out the extra oil. If that's because of this valving being dirty, I believe I can clean it out. So I'm hoping maybe, just maybe, I can clean this engine out good enough, and maybe the ATF I put in there is already starting to do that job, that chunk of debris will blow out and then it'll reseal itself. However, if it does not seal up, there's two options for this guy. It's either run a little bit thicker oil and then his oil pressure will be perfectly fine, or just run it as is. Because as long as he's not running a DOD system, he really has nothing to worry about anyway. He's got the thing shut off, and the only reason you need above the 27 PSI that the DOD requests is to make sure you can collapse the DOD lifters fast enough. And since we don't have to worry about that, obviously, all we really need is the 10 PSI at idle to keep everything lubricated. So, I am going to go ahead, slap this back together, and then I will throw my gauge on that bottom oil cooler fitting instead of the top one here, so that we can see if the pressure fluctuations are any greater at the bottom than what they are at the top. Perhaps that oil cooler is absorbing some of those fluctuations. So we're back at it. I got the fitting in the bottom section. It was a little tough to get in the bottom, and I gave it a bungee cord to try and straighten it out because it's trying to tweak over to one side. So it doesn't fit very well because it's a tight space down there, but I did get it in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to start the engine, watch the gauge, and then I'm going to be ending up adding some of this stuff here. Now, I have not tried this yet. This was actually given to me as a sample because I'm a Lucas supplier, complete engine treatment. And basically, I believe it's a similar thing to like a seafoam, but I don't think it's as thin because it doesn't feel like it's quite as thin. So we're going to go ahead and give this a try to clean the motor out. Okay, so you can see it's fluttering a little bit yet. It still doesn't appear to be any bubbles in the oil. So it's flowing a little bit slower because it's cold. But I'm going to go ahead and add this while it's running. So let's go ahead and see, get an idea of how thin this is. It's definitely pretty thin. I'm gonna get a feel of it quick here. Okay, so it feels more lubricated than like the seafoam stuff. The seafoam's more of a dry feel than this stuff is. So this has a little bit more of a lubricant to it. I'm gonna go ahead and start with half a can first. See what the oil pressure does, because the oil pressure was at about 45. So since it still appears to be at 45, I'm not afraid to overfill this thing a little bit and clean it out. So I'm going to go ahead and pour the rest of this in here, and we'll let it run for a while and clean itself out, see what happens. Now with the thinner oil, of course, because of the cleaner that I put in there, I do expect the oil pressure not only to drop a little bit, and when it gets hot to drop more so than it was before, but remember, I do still have some of the Lucas thickener stuff in there, so I got a lot of stuff added to this. I probably got a quart total of extra volume inside here that's overfilled, basically. But I'm going to be draining it out because even though he says this is fresh oil, it's just too dang dirty. So I want to drain it out, do an oil change, and then I'm going to see how the oil looks going through that glass tube. Because right now, if I shine a light underneath it, I cannot see through it at all. It's so dark I can't even see the brown oil color through that glass tube. So I'm gonna let this thing run, clean itself out, let the pressure drop, make sure it doesn't go below 10 psi for sure, and once it's all ran long enough, maybe the pressure all of a sudden go up. That means whatever dirt's in the lifter clean out. That'd be great. But if it doesn't, I will be changing the oil, running it again, and we'll go from there, I guess. Most likely he's gonna need lifters, unfortunately, and because of a new problem that I have not ran into yet. So little bit different scenario than the usual. Alright, so I just got done changing the oil. I put some 10W40 oil and a little bit zinc in there too as well, and I just fired it up. It's been running for, I don't know, minute and a half maybe tops, so it hasn't been running long. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you guys the oil itself. I took a little bit of a peek myself. I didn't look at the oil pressure yet, but I can actually see through the lens now, so I can see if there is bubbles going by, and there's no way there's a homogenize going on. At least I didn't see it for the short bit I looked, so let's take a look quick. So there you have it. There's the oil. It's flowing through there, but I see absolutely zero bubbles whatsoever. I mean, there is nothing. It's just perfectly clean, good oil going through there. But you can still see the oil pressure gauge is fluttering just a little bit. Not much, but this is kind of how it is when it's cold. It just kind of flickers just a wee bit, not much, but it's there, so it is still present. And part of the theory of the whole oil cooler thing, you know, I said it was fluttering before the oil cooler. This is the gauge after the oil cooler. It still flutters just about the same, and it fluttered much more without the oil cooler. I'd be willing to bet if I put the gauge on there without the oil cooler, it would flutter a lot more again. And there's a couple reasons for this. One of which is the gauge that I was using. It's a much bigger gauge, so the needle moves more, so it just appeared as though it was fluttering more. That's a big factor, but I also think that it is fluttering a little bit less, you know, as far as how many psi it goes back and forth, and I think that's because of the oil cooler itself. So the oil cooler is probably a plate style oil cooler, meaning there's several plates that are in a row, and those plates, they can expand and contract. So the flutter is the plates kind of moving back and forth and absorbing more or less the pressure fluctuations, causing it to show a little bit more maybe. I don't know. Just a theory. I don't know. Maybe I'm off. Maybe I'm way off. Who knows? But I'm gonna go ahead, put the plastics back on this vehicle while it's warming up. I'll probably take it for a drive. I'm gonna see how the pressure does. I have thicker oil in it now. I should be good to go. So I think this is gonna be one of those deals where he's just gonna have to run the vehicle as is. It's not worth putting all the money into replacing lifters for just a little bit of an oil pressure drop, especially if you can run just a little bit thicker oil to take care of it. If the problem gets worse later on, then hey, that's when you do the lifters, I guess. And with that, like, share, subscribe, and as always, I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.